Daniel stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt for the third time. He stared at himself, brushing an imaginary wrinkle from his sleeve and smoothing his hair. It wasn't a special occasion, not a birthday, not an anniversary. But tonight he felt like it was. He glanced at the watch Grace had given him for their 15th anniversary and smiled to himself. 20 years of marriage. It hadn't all been easy. They'd endured the highs and lows. A mortgage that sometimes felt like it would bury them alive, arguments that left them in separate rooms for days, and the quiet, unspoken fear that they had simply grown apart. But recently something had changed. It started subtly. A smile lingering a second longer than usual, casual conversations that stretched into late-night talks. Grace had laughed at one of his dad jokes last week. The real kind of laugh she hadn't given him in years. For a moment, Daniel had seen a glimpse of the woman he'd fallen in love with. The woman who used to make his heart race just by walking into a room. He wanted more of that. "You're getting sentimental in your old age," he muttered to his reflection, slipping on his jacket and heading downstairs. Grace was waiting by the door, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up when he walked in and smiled. An honest, warm smile that lit up her face. "You ready?" Daniel asked, offering his arm. Grace took it, linking her hand through his. "Lead the way, Mr. Gallagher." They drove in comfortable silence. Daniel glanced at her every so often, admiring the way her hair caught the streetlights. She wore a simple black dress, nothing flashy, but it hugged her just right, bringing back memories of their early years. She still looked just as stunning as she did on their wedding day. They pulled up to La Rosa, the Italian restaurant where they'd celebrated their 5th anniversary. It was a little fancier than their usual places, but tonight felt like it called for something special. The soft glow of candles lit every table, and a familiar jazz tune played softly in the background. Grace raised an eyebrow.
La Rosa?
"You're pulling out all the stops tonight." Daniel grinned. "Only the best for you." They ordered a bottle of wine, reminiscing about the last time they'd been there. Emma had only been 5 years old back then, drawing pictures on the paper tablecloths while they tried to have a grown-up conversation. "I miss those days," Grace said, swirling her wine. "Before life got so complicated." "We've still got plenty of time," Daniel said. "Who says the best days are behind us?" Her eyes sparkled for a moment, and Daniel felt a surge of confidence. This is working. Dinner was perfect. Warm bread, fresh pasta, and conversation that flowed as easily as the wine. Grace told stories from work, her eyes lighting up in that animated way he hadn't seen in years. Daniel hung on every word, reminding himself how much he loved hearing her talk. "You know," he said, resting his hand on hers across the table, "we should do this more often, just the two of us." Grace paused, her expression softening. "I'd like that." The waiter brought the check, and Daniel paid without hesitation. For once, he didn't even flinch at the price. It was worth every penny. As they walked back to the car, Grace slipped her arm around his waist. "Thanks for tonight," she whispered. "It was perfect." Daniel smiled, savoring the closeness. "We needed it." They drove home in silence, not the awkward kind, but the easy, content kind. When they pulled into the driveway, Grace leaned over and kissed his cheek. A soft, lingering kiss that sent a familiar warmth rushing through him. "Don't wait up," she said, heading inside. "I'm going to take a long shower." Daniel stood in the driveway for a moment, watching her go. His heart felt light, like they had turned a corner, like maybe, just maybe, they were finding their way back to each other. He parked the car and was just about to head inside when a text notification lit up Grace's phone on the counter. Daniel froze. Normally, he wouldn't even think about looking, but something stopped him this time. He hesitated, then glanced at the screen. It was a message from someone named Nathan. "I can't stop thinking about last night. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Red heart." Daniel's pulse quickened. He picked up the phone, scrolling through the messages. Each one hit harder than the last. "Emma thinks you're ready for this. I'm so glad we're finally doing this, Grace." His breath caught in his throat. Emma had encouraged it? His own daughter? The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his hand. His legs turned to lead, and his stomach twisted in knots. The warmth he'd felt all night dissolved into cold, raw disbelief. Daniel sat at the kitchen counter, his heart racing as he scrolled through the texts. His hands shook with every swipe, each message more damning than the last. Nathan wasn't just some colleague or old friend. He was someone Grace had been seeing. Recently, frequently, and Emma had encouraged it. He read one of the older texts again. Nathan, Emma's right. You deserve this, Grace. I'm so glad we finally decided to meet. The message was from 3 weeks ago. Daniel's chest tightened. 3 weeks. Right when they had started spending more time together, when he believed they were on the verge of rekindling something real. The memory of that first date night rushed back. How Grace had laughed at his jokes. How Emma had practically pushed them out the door. All of it had been a distraction, a convenient cover for whatever this was. His jaw clenched as he kept reading. Grace had mentioned meeting Nathan for dinner at the Green Room, a restaurant just a few blocks from where he and Grace had gone the following night. The messages were playful, sometimes flirtatious, and loaded with inside jokes that made Daniel feel like an outsider in his own marriage. He stared at the screen, his heart thudding in his chest. His stomach twisted into a painful knot as reality settled in. She was planning a date with Nathan tomorrow night. He heard Grace moving around upstairs, the shower running. Steam drifted down the hallway as the bathroom door opened. Daniel put the phone back on the counter, careful to leave it exactly where it had been. His breathing was shallow, his head spinning. He paced back and forth in the kitchen, unsure of what to do. Confront her now? Wait until tomorrow? The thought of facing her, of hearing her confirm what he already knew, filled him with dread. He wasn't ready for it. Not yet. Instead, Daniel grabbed his jacket and slipped out the front door. He needed air. He needed time to think. He drove aimlessly for an hour, the streets a blur as his thoughts raced. Every memory of the past few weeks felt tainted now. Every smile and touch undercut by the possibility that Grace had been thinking of someone else. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the fact that Emma knew. His daughter had been complicit in this, encouraging Grace to explore something outside of their marriage. Daniel pulled into an empty parking lot and sat in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He couldn't escape the image of Nathan, the man he had never met but who was clearly taking his place in ways he couldn't fathom. Who was Nathan? How long had this been going on? Was this just a fling? Or was it something more? He had always thought he would know if something like this happened. They had been married for 20 years. How could he not have noticed? The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Daniel returned home just after midnight. The house was dark and quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Grace was already asleep. He could hear her soft breathing from the bedroom. For a moment he stood in the doorway, watching her sleep. He wanted to believe she was still the woman he loved, the one he had fought so hard to reconnect with. But the messages on her phone told a different story. He went to the guest room, sat on the bed, and buried his face in his hands. Sleep didn't come easily that night. His mind churned with possibilities, plans, and the growing need for answers. Part 3, Confrontation. The next morning, Daniel was waiting at the kitchen table when Grace came downstairs. She wore her usual weekend outfit, jeans and a cozy sweater, but today it looked unfamiliar, like she was someone else entirely. She smiled at him. "You're up early. Coffee?" Daniel didn't smile back. His eyes locked on hers. "Who's Nathan?" Grace froze mid-step, her hand tightening on the coffee pot. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the drip of the coffee machine. "Daniel, I can explain," she said, her voice trembling. "Then explain," he said coldly, folding his arms. "Tell me why my wife is planning a date with another man. Tell me why Emma is encouraging it." Grace's face paled. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Daniel leaned forward. "I read the messages, every single one of them, so don't tell me it's nothing." Tears welled up in her eyes, but Daniel felt no sympathy. For the first time in 20 years, He felt like a stranger was standing in front of him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Grace whispered. "I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did." Daniel shook his head. "You didn't plan for it? What the hell does that even mean? You were meeting him behind my back." Emma knew. Our daughter knew. Grace wiped her eyes, her voice cracking. "Emma wanted me to be happy. She thought I needed something I wasn't getting anymore." "Something you weren't getting from me?" Daniel said bitterly. "I see." There was a long silence. Grace didn't deny it. She couldn't. The air between them was thick with everything left unsaid. For a brief second, Daniel hoped she would beg him to stay, tell him it was a mistake, that she still loved him. But instead, Grace just stood there, silent and broken. Daniel took a deep breath. "I'll pack a bag. I'm leaving for a few days." "Daniel, wait," Grace said, stepping toward him. "We can fix this. Please." He shook his head. "I don't think we can." He grabbed his keys and walked out the front door, slamming it behind him. He didn't know where he was going or how long he'd be gone. All he knew was that he couldn't stay in that house. Not right now. He needed space. He needed a plan. And somewhere deep down, in a part of his heart he barely recognized, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: rage. Daniel drove for hours, his mind spiraling deeper into the kind of thoughts he'd never dared entertain before. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, the weight of everything pressing down on him like a steel beam. Grace's face flashed in his mind. Those tears, the trembling voice as she tried to explain herself. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she had said, as if that could excuse it. And Emma, his own daughter, had helped orchestrate it all. He pulled into an empty parking lot and slammed his fist against the steering wheel so hard his fingers throbbed. He tried to breathe, but the rage in his chest refused to settle. He needed an outlet, some way to release the pressure building inside him. That's when it hit him. The studio. The photography studio had been Grace's dream for years. She had poured every ounce of her energy into it, sacrificing weekends and vacations to build it from scratch. Daniel had helped her at first, but over time, the studio had become more hers than theirs, a symbol of the growing distance between them. If it wasn't for that place, Daniel muttered to himself, none of this would have happened. The car's engine roared back to life as he made a sharp U-turn, heading straight for the studio. The building stood in darkness when he arrived, the neon sign turned off, the windows reflecting the streetlights like black mirrors. Daniel stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cool night air. He reached into the trunk and grabbed the can of gasoline he always kept for emergencies. "Is this really happening?" a voice in his head asked. But Daniel didn't stop to question it. He had crossed a line in his mind, and there was no going back. His heart pounded with an intensity that felt almost euphoric as he walked toward the front door. The door was unlocked. Grace often forgot to lock it after late nights of editing photos. He pushed it open, the soft chime of the bell echoing eerily in the empty space. The smell of chemicals and ink lingered in the air. Photos hung from wires, swaying gently in the draft from the open door. He walked past images of families, smiling couples, children celebrating birthdays, all of them frozen in time, their happiness captured forever. He hated it. He hated every single picture in that room. With a steady hand, Daniel unscrewed the cap of the gasoline can and began pouring it in a wide arc across the floor. It soaked into the hardwood, leaving dark, jagged streaks. He moved from corner to corner, splashing it on the desks, the walls, and the shelves filled with Grace's carefully curated albums. The smell was overwhelming now, stinging his eyes and throat. He stood in the middle of the studio, breathing hard, the empty can dangling from his fingers. For a moment he hesitated. He thought of Emma as a little girl, sitting on the floor of this very studio, helping Grace sort through photos. He thought of their early days when the studio had been a shared dream, something they'd built together. But that was a long time ago. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a lighter. He flicked it open, the tiny flame dancing in front of him. "This is what you deserve," he whispered. He dropped the lighter. The fire caught instantly, roaring to life as it devoured the gasoline-soaked floor. Flames climbed the walls, licking at the shelves and consuming everything in their path. Within seconds, the entire room was engulfed in a glowing, orange inferno. Daniel stood in the doorway watching it burn. His face felt hot, his skin tingling from the heat. The fire crackled and hissed, the sound almost soothing in its chaos. For the first time in days, Daniel felt calm. He stayed just long enough to make sure the flames had taken hold, then walked back to his car. Behind him, the studio burned brightly, sending plumes of smoke into the night sky. He didn't look back. Daniel drove home, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. His clothes smelled of smoke and gasoline, but he didn't care. He felt lighter, freer than he had in weeks. He pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, staring at the darkened house. He had expected to feel guilty, to regret what he'd done. But all he felt was relief. He climbed out of the car, walked inside, and locked the door behind him. Then he went straight to bed. For the first time in days, Daniel slept like a baby. Part 5: Cutting Ties. Daniel woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He glanced at the screen. 5 missed calls from Grace and a flurry of texts. Grace: Daniel, where are you? Call me. It's urgent. Grace: the studio, it's gone. Everything's gone. Grace: please, we need to talk. Daniel stared at the messages, his face blank. He felt no urge to respond, no tug of responsibility. Instead, he got out of bed, showered, and started packing a bag. He moved deliberately, folding clothes and placing them neatly in his suitcase. When he was done, he stood in the center of the room, surveying the life he was about to leave behind. Then he picked up his phone, scrolled to Grace's number, and sent one final text. We're done. He hit send, tossed the phone on the bed, and walked out the front door. Daniel stepped off the plane and into the sweltering heat of Jaipur, India. The air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of spices, street food, and something he couldn't quite place. A mix of the unfamiliar and the exhilarating. The chaotic hum of the airport surrounded him. Travelers shouting in Hindi, taxi drivers vying for passengers, horns honking in rapid succession. He clutched his single suitcase, the only piece of his old life he'd brought with him, and moved through the crowd. He had no plan, no grand strategy. All he knew was that he needed to be as far away from his old life as possible. Jaipur, the pink city, had always intrigued him, the colors, the culture, the history. It was a city bursting with life, and that was exactly what Daniel needed. A place so different from everything he knew that it could bury the past. He found a modest guest house just outside the bustling market square. His room was small but clean, with pale yellow walls and a creaky ceiling fan that spun lazily overhead. Outside, the sounds of the city filtered through the open window. Vendors calling out their wares, rickshaw engines sputtering, the distant hum of temple bells. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, the noise in his head quieted. The weight of everything he'd left behind, Grace, Emma, the studio, felt lighter here, like it couldn't reach him in this strange, beautiful place. This was a fresh start. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel slowly began to settle into his new life. He wandered the city aimlessly, losing himself in its labyrinthine streets. He marveled at the pink sandstone buildings, the intricate architecture of the Hawa Mahal, and the sprawling bazaars filled with vibrant textiles, jewelry, and spices. The chaos of Jaipur was strangely comforting. The city's relentless energy left no room for introspection. There were always new sights to see, new foods to try, new people to meet. One afternoon, Daniel found himself in a tiny café tucked away in a quiet alley. The owner, a wiry man named Ravi, greeted him with a warm smile and broken English. "First time here?" Ravi asked, handing him a steaming cup of chai. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, just passing through." Ravi sat down across from him, wiping his hands on a towel. "India has a way of making people stay longer than they plan." Daniel chuckled, sipping the chai. It was sweet and spicy with a hint of ginger. He thought about what Ravi said. Maybe he was right. A month later, Daniel wasn't just passing through anymore. He had rented a small apartment above a tailor's shop and had even started helping Ravi at the café. It was nothing fancy, just a few tables and a chalkboard menu, but it had become his sanctuary. He learned how to brew the perfect cup of masala chai, how to haggle with local vendors for fresh spices, and how to string together enough Hindi to get by. Customers came and went, and Daniel found comfort in the rhythm of it all. In the evenings, he sat on the rooftop of his apartment, watching the sun set over the city. Jaipur bathed itself in warm pinks and oranges, the sky reflecting the city's nickname. Daniel would sip his chai and let the chaos of the day melt away. And slowly, he began to feel like a different person. But no matter how far he ran, the past had a way of catching up. One night, after closing the café, Daniel sat with Ravi, sharing a bottle of cheap rum. "You were married?" Ravi asked, his eyes glinting with curiosity. Daniel nodded, staring into his glass. "For 20 years. What happened?" Daniel hesitated. He hadn't told anyone about Grace or what had driven him here. He didn't even say her name aloud anymore. But something about the question caught him off guard. Maybe it was the rum, or maybe it was the months of silence. But the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "I caught her cheating," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I burned down the studio she loved, and then I left." Ravi didn't react the way Daniel expected. He didn't recoil or judge. Instead, he nodded slowly, pouring another glass of rum. "Sometimes, when a tree is dying, you have to burn it down so something new can grow," Ravi said. Daniel stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or cry. That night, as he lay in bed, Ravi's words echoed in his mind. Burn it down. Let something new grow. He had tried to burn his old life to the ground, but pieces of it still clung to him. Small fragments that refused to be forgotten. Grace's face, Emma's laugh, the way the studio had smelled of coffee and fresh ink. He wondered if they ever thought about him. If Grace had rebuilt her business. If Emma regretted what she'd done. For a fleeting moment, Daniel thought about calling them. But the thought passed just as quickly. He had chosen this path. There was no going back. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a clear head and a sense of purpose. He would build something new here, something that wasn't tied to the past. He helped Ravi redesign the cafe, adding new dishes to the menu, expanding the outdoor seating. He painted the walls a bright, welcoming shade of blue and hung lanterns from the ceiling. The cafe became a gathering place for locals and tourists alike. People came for the food, stayed for the stories, and returned because Daniel made them feel like they belonged. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself, but it was a life. And for now, that was enough. Back in the States, Grace stood in the charred remains of her photography studio. The walls were blackened, and the smell of smoke still lingered in the air despite the weeks that had passed. She traced her fingers along the burned edges of an old photo frame, her heart breaking all over again. Everything she had worked for was gone. The fire had taken more than just her studio. It had taken her sense of purpose, the identity she had carefully built over the past 10 years. The insurance payout would barely cover the basics, let alone help her rebuild. The business was dead, and Grace didn't have the energy to revive it. But the studio wasn't the only thing that had been destroyed. Daniel had left without another word. The day after he walked out, Grace had received that cold, final text message. "We're done." She hadn't heard from him since. He'd changed his number, cut off all contact, and vanished. For the first few weeks, Grace had told herself he just needed space. He'd come back. He always did. But deep down, she knew better. Emma sat across from her mother at the kitchen table, her eyes filled with guilt. She had moved back home to support Grace, but every moment in that house felt like a reminder of how badly things had gone wrong. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad," Emma said softly, stirring her tea. I thought you deserved to be happy again." Grace didn't respond right away. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale from weeks of sleepless nights and forced conversations. "I know you were trying to help," Grace finally said. But I should have known better. I should have stopped it before it got this far. Emma blinked back tears. I never wanted him to leave. I didn't either, Grace whispered, her voice cracking. But we broke him, Emma. We pushed him too far. The silence between them stretched out, heavy with regret. Grace spent most days curled up on the couch, scrolling through old photos of their family. Snapshots of simpler times when life had felt full of possibility. She had always thought their love was strong enough to survive anything. Even during the roughest patches, she believed they would eventually find their way back to each other. But now that hope was gone. Daniel was gone. Grace had tried to call him, email him, even reach out to mutual friends. But there was nothing. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. The loneliness was suffocating. One night, after finishing a bottle of wine by herself, Grace sat on the porch and stared out at the empty street. She had never felt so alone. Her thoughts drifted to Daniel. Where was he? What was he doing? Did he think about her at all? The idea of him living a new life without her, without Emma, felt like a punch to the gut. She couldn't stop herself from imagining it. Daniel laughing in some café with strangers, free from the weight of their broken marriage. Grace buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Emma tried her best to keep things together, but it wasn't easy. She had been the one who told her mother to go out with Nathan in the first place. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. Grace had been stuck in a rut for years, barely smiling, barely living. Emma had just wanted her mom to feel alive again. She hadn't expected everything to blow up the way it had. She never thought her dad would find out, or that his reaction would be so final, so unforgiving. Every day, she fought the urge to call him, to apologize and beg him to come home. But she didn't know what to say. How do you make amends for something like this? So instead, she stayed quiet, watching her mother sink deeper into sadness. Time moved slowly. The first month was unbearable. Grace barely left the house. She survived on takeout and cheap wine, ignoring calls from friends and pretending to be okay when Emma was around. By the second month, the numbness had set in. Grace functioned like a robot, going through the motions without really feeling anything. Then, one afternoon, she got a letter in the mail. It was from Daniel's lawyer. Grace opened it with shaking hands. It was short and to the point. Daniel had sold the house. They had 30 days to vacate the property. "Mom," Emma said, catching the look on Grace's face as she read the letter. "What is it?" Grace handed her the paper silently, her hand trembling. Emma's eyes widened. "He's selling the house? He didn't even tell us?" Grace nodded numbly. "He's really gone, Emma. He's not coming back." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emma wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her tight. "We'll be okay," Emma said, her voice cracking. "We'll figure it out. We always do." Grace nodded, though she didn't believe it. Not yet, but maybe one day she would. The tension had been building for weeks. The once calm, supportive relationship between Grace and Emma was now strained to the breaking point. The letter about the house had only made things worse, turning the quiet sadness that lingered between them into something far more volatile. They tried to keep it civil at first, but every conversation seemed to spiral into an argument. Emma blamed Grace for everything. For the affair, for pushing Daniel away, for turning their lives upside down. And Grace? Grace blamed herself too, at least in part. But hearing it from her daughter, spoken out loud with such raw anger, made it all feel unbearable. One evening, the tension finally boiled over. Started small, as it always did. Grace was packing up boxes in the living room, trying to sort through 20 years of memories. Emma walked in, arms crossed, watching her mother silently for a moment before speaking. "So, what's the plan?" Emma asked, her tone sharp. "We just leave everything behind and pretend none of this ever happened?" Grace exhaled slowly, setting down a photo album. She didn't have the energy for another fight. "We're not pretending, Emma. We're moving on. We don't have a choice." Emma folded her arms. "You always say that. We didn't have a choice. But we did. You did. You could have stopped this before it got so bad." Grace's eyes narrowed. And you think I don't know that? You think I haven't replayed it 1,000 times in my head? I made a mistake. A huge mistake. But you encouraged it. Emma, you told me to go out with Nathan. You practically pushed me into it. Emma's face turned red. I told you to be happy, Mom. I didn't tell you to blow up your entire life. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace stared at her daughter, her heart aching in a way she couldn't describe. She knew Emma was right. She had been reckless, selfish. She had destroyed their family. I did what I thought was best, Grace said quietly. I was lonely, and I didn't know how to fix things with your dad. Emma shook her head. No, you didn't even try. You just gave up on him. And now he's gone. He's gone because of you. That hit harder than Grace expected. She opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself. What could she say? That Emma was wrong? Because deep down, Grace knew she wasn't. Emma turned and walked to the stairs. I can't do this anymore, she said over her shoulder. I can't stay here and pretend we're okay. We're not. Grace's chest tightened. Emma, wait. Please. Let's talk this through. Emma didn't stop. She disappeared into her room, slamming the door behind her. 15 minutes later, Grace heard the sound of a suitcase being dragged down the stairs. Where are you going? Grace asked, standing frozen in the doorway. I'm staying with a friend, Emma said, not looking her mother in the eye. I need some space. Grace's throat tightened. Emma, please, don't go like this. We can work it out. Emma shook her head. We've been trying to work it out for months, and it's only gotten worse. I need to get away for a while. I'll call you when I'm ready. And with that, she was gone. The house felt impossibly quiet after Emma left. Grace stood at the window, watching the taillights of her daughter's car fade into the distance. Her chest felt hollow, like the very air had been sucked out of her lungs. For the first time since the fire, Grace was truly alone. The silence was suffocating. She wandered through the house aimlessly, her footsteps echoing off the empty walls. Every room held a memory. Daniel reading on the couch, Emma building pillow forts in the living room, family dinners filled with laughter and warmth. All of it was gone. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the half-packed boxes around her. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand, but she didn't pick it up. She knew it wasn't Emma. It was Nathan. He had called several times since the fire, leaving voicemail after voicemail, but Grace hadn't answered a single one. The last thing she wanted was to hear his voice. Nathan wasn't part of her life anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. Not since the fire, not since Daniel had left. Whatever brief comfort she had found in him was meaningless now. Her chest ached with a strange, hollow pain. She thought about calling Emma, but she knew it was too soon. She thought about calling Daniel, but she knew it was impossible. So instead, she just sat there in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the house settling around her. For the first time in a long time, Grace had no idea what came next. The house was emptier than Grace ever imagined it could be. Every corner seemed to echo with the absence of what used to be. The laughter, the arguments, the mundane moments that had once made up a life. The rooms felt hollow, each box she packed taking a piece of her past with it. The deadline to vacate the house was fast approaching. Grace moved through the house slowly, sorting through 20 years of memories. Photos, old clothes, books that still smelled faintly of Daniel's cologne. She couldn't bring herself to throw any of it away. Every item she touched carried a memory too heavy to discard. But there was no avoiding it now. Everything had changed. Emma was gone, Daniel was gone, and the house, the last piece of the life she had built, would soon be someone else's. The day the moving truck came, Grace stood on the front porch, watching the movers load the last of the boxes. Her heart felt like it had been hollowed out, leaving only an aching void. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out, half expecting another message from Nathan or an update from the real estate agent. But it wasn't either. It was a text from Emma. Emma, hey Mom, just checking in.
I'm okay.
Hope you're doing all right. Love you. Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't heard from Emma since the day she left, and even though it was a short message, it felt like a lifeline. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she replied. Grace, I'm glad you're okay. I miss you. I love you too. That night, Grace sat on the floor of her empty living room, a glass of wine in her hand. She stared at the blank walls, thinking about the years they had spent in that house. The family dinners, Emma's first steps, the fights, the reconciliations. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine what might have been if things had gone differently. If she had chosen to fight for her marriage instead of running from it. If she had found the courage to tell Daniel how she really felt instead of seeking comfort elsewhere. But regrets were just ghosts. They couldn't change what had already been done. Grace took a deep breath, the realization settling heavily in her chest. She couldn't fix the past, but she could still build something new. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in the heart of Jaipur, Daniel was building his own new life. The café had grown into a popular spot, a meeting place for locals and travelers alike. Daniel had thrown himself into the work, redesigning the menu, expanding the seating area, and learning more about Indian cuisine than he ever thought possible. Ravi often joked that Daniel was more invested in the café than he was. Every day brought something new customers, new challenges, new distractions. But despite the busy days and bustling café, there were still quiet moments when the past crept back in. Daniel thought of Grace often. He wondered if she had rebuilt the studio, if Emma was doing well, if they had stayed in the house or moved on. Sometimes he caught himself staring at the café door, half expecting Grace to walk in, camera in hand, ready to capture a piece of the world. One evening, Daniel sat on the rooftop of his apartment, watching the sun set over the city. Jaipur was bathed in warm pinks and oranges, the sky reflecting the vibrant chaos of the streets below. He sipped a cup of chai, letting the warmth spread through him. He thought about the fire. He thought about the text message he had sent Grace before he left. He thought about the family he had walked away from without ever looking back. For the first time in a long while, he let himself feel the weight of it. He pulled out his phone and opened a blank message. His thumb hovered over the keyboard, 1,000 words flooding his mind. Apologies, explanations, things he had wanted to say for months but had never found the courage to write. But as quickly as the moment came, it passed. Daniel locked the phone and set it aside. Some things were better left unsaid. Back in the States, Grace stood outside her new apartment, a small but cozy place with a balcony overlooking a park. It wasn't the house she had spent the last 20 years in, but it was home. She walked inside and placed a photo on the mantel, a picture of her, Daniel, and Emma on a family vacation years ago. They were laughing, sunburned and sweaty, but undeniably happy. Grace smiled softly, running her fingers over the frame. For the first time in months, the pain felt distant, like an old scar that no longer ached. She wasn't healed, not completely, but she was getting there, one step at a time. Thousands of miles apart, Grace and Daniel sat in their respective homes, both of them staring out into the night. In Jaipur, Daniel whispered into the stillness, "I hope you're okay." And somewhere across the ocean, Grace lit a candle on her balcony, her voice barely a whisper, "I miss you." Neither of them heard the other, but somehow in that fleeting moment it was enough. They were moving forward. The end.